They abandoned the crying widow on the trail until a lone rancher stepped forward to marry her before they returned. Eliza Turner stood in the middle of the trail as the wagon rolled away without her. Dust clung to her boots and hem. Her small wooden trunk lay in the dirt beside her, thrown down without ceremony. Thomas Hargrove never turned around. He only lifted a hand once, dismissive, final, and the wagon moved faster. One of the men shifted as if he might look back. He didn't. The wheels carved deeper tracks into the earth, widening the distance with every turn. Eliza swallowed hard, her throat burning. She had buried her husband 2 weeks ago. Now she was being buried again, this time in dust. The wagon crested the bend ahead. For a moment its outline blurred in heat and grit, then it disappeared completely. Silence followed. The land felt too wide, too open, too unforgiving. Eliza remained standing longer than she meant to, as if refusing to accept what had just happened might somehow undo it. The wind passed through dry grass in restless waves. Finally, her knees weakened. She lowered herself beside the trunk, pressing her palm into the dirt for balance. She did not scream. She did not curse them. The tears came quietly instead, streaking through dust along her cheeks. Winter was not far, and she was alone. Hoofbeats broke the silence, measured, steady, approaching from the western ridge. Eliza stiffened immediately and wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, forcing herself upright. A lone rider descended the slope at an unhurried pace, posture straight, gaze sharp. He took in the abandoned trunk, the fresh wagon tracks, the woman standing where no settlement stood within sight. He slowed several yards away. His eyes followed the direction of the disappearing wagon, then returned to her. "They leave you?" he asked calmly. Eliza lifted her chin despite the tremor in her hands. "They said they'd come back." The rancher looked once more at the fading line of dust. "No," he said quietly. "They won't." She behind Caleb in silence, her hands gripping the back of his coat, while the trail stretched long behind them. Neither spoke. The wind cut colder now that the sun had dipped lower, and she did not look back toward the ridge where she had been left. When the ranch finally came into view, it stood wide against the horizon. Fenced, working, solid. The ranch was simple, working, and unwelcoming to strangers. Caleb dismounted first and helped her down without ceremony. "You'll stay here tonight," he said evenly. "No promise beyond that." Ranch hands paused mid-task, their stares direct and curious. A few exchanged quiet glances. Widow, trouble, stranger. Eliza felt each word without hearing it spoken. Caleb gave short instructions: water the horse, stable the saddle, and the men obeyed without argument, though their curiosity lingered. Inside the house, Caleb set her trunk near the wall. "Backroom locks," he said. She noticed that immediately. Outside, 2 of the ranch hands lingered near the fence line. "If those wagon men circle back?" one asked quietly. Caleb didn't look at him. "How far north were they headed?" "Not far enough to avoid coming back if supplies thin." Caleb nodded once. That confirmed it. He stepped back onto the porch where Eliza stood, watching the horizon. "How certain are you they'll return?" he asked. "Thomas doesn't waste," she answered softly. Caleb's jaw shifted slightly. He had seen men like that, calculating, practical, cold. "If they do return," he said, "they'll expect you where they left you." The implication settled between them. Unprotected, unclaimed, replaceable. Eliza straightened despite the fatigue pulling at her shoulders. "I will not go back with them." Caleb studied her for a long moment. The decision forming in his mind did not come from impulse. It came from clarity. "Then we don't wait," he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. His gaze returned to the northern ridge. For them to decide your future again. Word traveled faster than Caleb expected. By afternoon, 2 ranch hands had already paused near the porch, long enough for the question to surface. "Those wagon men coming back?" one asked quietly. Caleb stood with his back to the yard, gaze fixed on the distant ridge. "Likely." The answer was simple, not dramatic, just factual. Eliza stepped onto the porch behind him, hearing enough to understand the direction of the conversation. She did not interrupt. She only listened. Mrs. Dalton arrived before sunset, skirts gathered in one hand, expression sharpened by curiosity. "Caleb Ashford," she said carefully. "I hear you brought someone in from the trail." Caleb turned slightly. "I did." Mrs. Dalton's eyes moved to Eliza. "That won't sit well if her party returns." Caleb did not soften his tone. "It doesn't need to sit." Eliza felt the air tighten again, felt the shift from person to potential problem. Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice. "If they claim her, it will become public." Caleb stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Eliza and the open yard. Not aggressively, just enough to make his position unmistakable. "They abandoned her," he said evenly. Mrs. Dalton folded her arms. "That may not be how they tell it?" Silence lingered for a moment. The ranch hands watched without pretending not to. Eliza lifted her chin. "They left me without food or water," she said clearly. Mrs. Dalton studied her face, weighing truth against rumor. Caleb's voice remained level. "She's under my protection." The words were deliberate, public, not whispered. The ranch hands straightened subtly at that. Mrs. Dalton hesitated, then nodded once, though doubt still flickered behind her eyes. "Protection has consequences," she warned. Caleb met her gaze without flinching. "So does abandonment." The statement settled over the porch like a marker driven into ground. No further warnings followed, no layered murmurs, just a visible line drawn where Eliza now stood. Not as cargo, not as burden, but as someone claimed by decision. The ranch quieted after dusk, but the unease did not. Eliza sat on the narrow bed in the back room Caleb had given her, hands folded in her lap, listening to the low murmur of men outside the house. The door did lock. She noticed that again. It mattered more than comfort. Outside near the stable, 2 ranch hands spoke in hushed tones. "Wagon tracks headed north," one said. "If they run short, they'll circle back." Caleb stood beside them, arms folded, gaze fixed toward the dark horizon. "How many men?" he asked. 4, maybe 5. Caleb nodded slowly. Not a small group. Not careless men. He understood the type. Practical. Opportunistic. If they returned and found her alone, they could claim responsibility, or claim she belonged with them. The law on the frontier was rarely written. It was argued. Inside, Eliza stepped onto the porch quietly. "They will come back," she said. Caleb turned toward her. "You're certain?" She swallowed. "Thomas doesn't leave unfinished matters." The words held weight. Caleb absorbed that carefully. "If they return," he said evenly, "they will expect you unprotected." Eliza lifted her chin slightly. "I do not belong to them. That won't stop them from saying you do." The ranch hands fell silent. The wind moved low across the grass, carrying the faint scent of coming cold. Caleb's mind was already moving through options: force, confrontation, law, leverage. Then one solution settled above the others. Simple, immediate, final. He looked at her steadily. "If they return tomorrow," he said, "they must find you beyond their reach." Eliza frowned slightly. "How?" Caleb's answer did not come lightly. It came clearly. "As my wife." The ranch hand stiffened. Eliza stared at him, stunned into stillness. He did not step closer. He did not soften the statement. "If you remain unmarried," he continued calmly, "they can argue guardianship, protection, obligation." His eyes did not waver. "But if you are married, they have no claim." Silence stretched across the porch. Even the wind seemed to pause. Eliza's voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "You would marry me for defense?" Caleb met her gaze without hesitation. "I would marry you so they cannot take you." The night deepened around them, and somewhere beyond the dark horizon, wagon wheels were still turning. Eliza stood at the edge of the porch as dusk pressed low over the pasture, the northern ridge fading into shadow. Caleb joined her without speaking at first. The quiet between them was not awkward. It was calculating. "They'll circle back if supplies run thin," he said calmly. Eliza nodded once. "Thomas won't leave unfinished matters." Caleb rested his forearms lightly on the porch rail. "If they return tomorrow, I won't let them find you alone." The statement carried no emotion, only certainty. Eliza turned toward him. "You mean to stand against them?" "If necessary." A beat of silence passed. "But there's a simpler solution." She already sensed what was coming. "Marriage," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "If you remain unmarried, they can argue obligation, protection, guardianship." His gaze did not waver. "If you're my wife, they have no claim." The wind shifted across the yard. Eliza's hands tightened briefly at her sides. "You would bind yourself to a stranger for that?" Caleb did not hesitate. "I would bind myself so they cannot bind you." The answer landed heavier than persuasion. She searched his face for hesitation, and found none. "And if they never return?" she asked. "Then you remain married to a man who does not discard what he stands beside." He did not embellish it further. No vows, no promises beyond what was necessary. Just structure. Just protection. Eliza looked toward the darkening trail where she had been left in dust only hours earlier. The choice did not feel romantic. It felt decisive. She inhaled slowly. "If we do this," she said, "it will not be charity." "It won't," Caleb replied. A pause. "It will be protection." The word hung steady between them. Eliza lifted her chin slightly. "Then before they return," she said, "we do not wait." Caleb gave a single nod. "I'll send for Pastor Cole." No further discussion followed. The plan had been made. And somewhere beyond the ridge, wheels might already be turning back. Pastor William Cole arrived before noon, his small carriage raising a modest trail of dust as it approached the ranch house, and he did not ask many questions when Caleb explained the situation plainly. The pastor had served the frontier long enough to understand that sometimes marriage was not celebration. It was shield. "Is this your will?" he asked Eliza gently once they stood beneath the porch beam. She met his gaze directly. "Yes." No trembling, no hesitation. Caleb stood beside her, posture straight, expression composed. The ceremony was brief. 2 ranch hands stood as witnesses. Mrs. Dalton remained near the steps, observing without commentary. There were no flowers, no music, just wind moving softly through dry grass and the quiet cadence of vows spoken clearly in daylight. When the pastor asked Caleb if he would take Eliza as his wife, he answered firmly, "I will." When he asked Eliza, she said, "I do." No one applauded. No one cheered. It was not that kind of wedding. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb did not lift her hand triumphantly or draw her close. He simply nodded once, as if something necessary had been completed. The pastor signed the small ledger he carried and pressed it into Caleb's hands. "Keep this safe," he said. The paper mattered now. Inside the house, Eliza stood quietly in the front room while Caleb stepped outside to scan the horizon. The sky remained clear, but distant dust shimmered faintly near the northern ridge. It might have been wind. It might have been nothing. He did not assume either. Eliza joined him on the porch. "It's done," she said softly. Caleb glanced toward her, not with ownership but with acknowledgement. "Yes." She folded her hands before her. "If they return?" she asked. His answer was steady. "They will find Mrs. Ashford." The name hung between them, unfamiliar yet firm. Eliza turned her gaze toward the distant trail where she had once been left standing alone. The ranch no longer felt like borrowed ground. It felt claimed. And somewhere beyond the ridge, wagon wheels might already be turning back. The wagon appeared just after sunrise, its wheels grinding toward the ranch gate with the same stubborn rhythm Eliza remembered. Caleb saw it first. He stood near the fence line, arms resting loosely on the rail, posture relaxed but immovable. Eliza stood on the porch steps behind him, hands steady at her sides. Ranch hands had already paused their work, forming a loose line without being told. Thomas Hargrove climbed down from the wagon before it fully stopped. His gaze scanned the yard, then locked onto Eliza. "Morning," he called, though the word carried no warmth. Caleb did not move from the fence. "You're early," he replied evenly. Thomas stepped forward, boots pressing into the dirt. "We came to collect what we left." Eliza did not retreat. "You left me," she said calmly. Thomas ignored her and addressed Caleb instead. "She was traveling under my supervision." Caleb pushed off the fence and walked forward until he stood several feet from Thomas. Close enough, not threatening. "You abandoned her," he said. Thomas took a step toward Eliza. Caleb shifted once, not aggressively, just enough to make the line clear. The movement was small but unmistakable. Thomas stopped. The ranch yard held its breath. "She's coming with us," Thomas said, voice tightening. "No," Caleb answered. The refusal carried no heat. That unsettled Thomas more than anger would have. "You don't decide that," Thomas snapped. Eliza stepped forward beside Caleb now, not behind him. "I do," she said. Thomas's jaw hardened. "You were under my protection." Caleb's voice remained level. "She is under mine." The air tightened further. "On what authority?" Thomas demanded. Caleb did not glance away. "As her husband." The word settled across the yard like a weight dropped from height. Thomas stared at him, disbelief flashing briefly before calculation replaced it. The ranch hands stood firm behind Caleb. Witnesses. Alignment. Eliza did not lower her gaze. Thomas looked between them once more. "That doesn't make it lawful," he said slowly, but the certainty in his voice had thinned. And for the first time since arriving, he was no longer the man in control. Thomas's eyes narrowed, but the certainty behind them had already begun to fracture. "Lawful?" he repeated. "You expect me to believe this happened overnight?" Caleb did not react to the tone. "It did," he said evenly. Pastor William Cole stepped forward from the porch, leather-bound ledger in hand. He did not hurry. He did not defend. He simply opened the book and held it where ink still appeared dark and fresh. "The marriage was performed yesterday," he said calmly. "Recorded before witnesses." He closed the ledger again, no further explanation. Thomas glanced at the ranch hands standing firm behind Caleb, then at the few townspeople who had gathered near the road. No one looked uncertain. "She was traveling under my supervision," Thomas pressed. Eliza stepped forward before Caleb could answer. "I was abandoned," she said, her voice steady and clear, "left on the trail without food or water." A quiet murmur moved through the small crowd. Thomas tried again. We intended to return. Eliza did not waver. You left without promise. The distinction cut clean. Thomas turned sharply toward Caleb. You barely know her. Caleb's reply came without hesitation. I know enough. Silence followed. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just alignment. The ranch hands did not move. Pastor Cole stood calm. Eliza remained upright beside her husband. Thomas searched for weakness and found none. The argument had narrowed to one simple truth. She had been abandoned, and she was now married. Nothing further complicated it. Thomas exhaled sharply. You think this ends it? He asked quietly. Caleb's answer was steady. It already has. The words landed without flourish, but their weight was unmistakable. Thomas looked once more at Eliza, perhaps expecting doubt. He found none. What he saw instead was decision. And decision, once witnessed publicly, is difficult to undo. Thomas stood still for several long seconds, the open yard and silent witnesses pressing in around him. His authority, once assumed, no longer carried weight here. He tried once more. You've taken advantage of a grieving woman, he said, though the accusation lacked force. Caleb did not react. I offered her choice, he replied evenly. Something you did not. Eliza stepped forward beside him, not shielded but standing. You left me, she said, her voice steady now, stripped of fear. You decided my worth by the weight of supplies. A faint shift passed through the onlookers. Thomas's jaw tightened. We were preserving our chances. Caleb tilted his head slightly. By discarding someone? The question did not need embellishment. Thomas looked towards the wagon, toward the road, toward anything that might restore control. Nothing did. Caleb stepped forward just enough to close the distance. Not threatening, not loud, simply present. You made your choice on that trail, he said quietly. This is hers. Silence followed. It was heavier than argument. Thomas's gaze moved to Eliza one last time, searching for hesitation. She did not look away. Whatever claim he believed he held had dissolved under public witness. Finally he turned. Drive, he muttered to his men. The wagon wheels creaked into motion again, but this time they carried retreat instead of authority. No one cheered. No one celebrated. The victory was quieter than that. The line had been drawn, not in anger, not in violence, but in decision. And Thomas Hargrove stepped back from it. The ranch felt different the morning after the wagon disappeared beyond the ridge. Not louder, not brighter, just settled. Eliza stood near the fence where the confrontation had taken place, her hands resting lightly on the rail. The tracks in the dirt were already fading. Caleb approached without hurry and stopped beside her. He did not stand in front of her. He stood with her. They won't return, he said evenly. Eliza nodded once. No. The word carried certainty now, not fear. For a moment they watched the horizon in silence, the same stretch of land that had swallowed her when she was left behind. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. Caleb did not look away from the open field. Yes, I did. That was all. No elaboration. No explanation. The wind moved softly through the pasture, lifting the grass in slow waves. Eliza traced her fingers along the wood of the fence, grounding herself in something solid. On the trail, she said after a moment, I thought I had nothing left. Caleb turned slightly toward her. You did. She met his eyes, waiting. You were still standing. The simplicity of it settled deeply. There had been no grand rescue, no dramatic claim. Only a decision made before witnesses. A choice that could not be undone by men who returned too late. Eliza looked once more toward the distant bend where she had been abandoned. Then she turned away from it fully. "Mrs. Ashford," she said softly, testing the name without hesitation this time. Caleb gave a single nod. Mrs. Ashford. The ranch hands moved in the distance, ordinary work continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And that felt right. The world had not shifted violently. It had simply corrected itself. Eliza stood a little straighter beside him. This time she wasn't standing alone. If someone abandoned you in your darkest moment, would you still believe someone would stand beside you? If you enjoy powerful frontier stories about protection, dignity, and unexpected love, subscribe Native American Tales for more Western stories.